We're going to talk about the skull using two different models. The first thing we're going to do today is identify the major bones and the sutures that connect these bones. In the front here in red, this is the frontal bone. We look on the sides, we see two flat bones. These are the parietal bones. On the posterior aspect in green is the occipital bone. We're going to go back to the side. We have two paired bones, one on each side. This is the temporal bone. Here in blue, this is the zygomatic bone. These are also paired. Here in front in purple, this is the maxilla. Again, paired bone. We have two of them. This is what holds our upper teeth. On the bottom here, this is the mandible, which holds our lower teeth. There are a few minor bones that are a little bit harder to identify. We'll see those on a different model. But right here in red, this one is the vomer. That's an unpaired bone. We see one that is embedded deep here. This is the ethmoid. Do you see this little bit right here? These are the nasal bones paired. We go right into the center here. This tiny little bone in green is the lacrimal bone. They're paired, one on each side. And then a very difficult one to see in this model, we're going to tilt this up. This is the sphenoid bone. We're going to look at that in much greater detail a little bit later on. This looks like a little butterfly by itself. Then we're going to talk about sutures. What separates the frontal bone from the two parietal bones? Right down the center is the coronal suture. What separates the two parietal bones going down the sagittal plane here would be the sagittal suture. In the back, what separates the occipital bone here from the two parietal bones, looks like a lambda, would be the lambdoidal suture. On the side here, separating the temporal bone from the parietal, is the squamosal suture. The word squamous means flat, and this portion of the bone is very flat. So this is called the squamosal suture. We also have two soft spots. These bones form independently and are later fused together as the person ages. This suture at the top, the anterior fontanelle, is called the bregma or bregmatic fontanelle. This is a soft spot, the baby's soft spot, that doesn't close until baby's about 2 years old. On the back here, by the lambdoid, we have another fontanelle, posterior fontanelle. It's also called the lambdoidal fontanelle. And again, this does not close until the first couple years of life. We're going to look at a model which is not exploded, which is a little bit harder to tell. You might think initially because they're all the same color, but in fact it's the same thing. We have our frontal bone, two parietal bones, occipital bone. On either side are two temporal bones. Okay. So coming across here is our coronal suture down the middle, sagittal suture in the back, lambdoidal suture. We have our anterior fontanelle, also called the bregma. This is not a fontanelle because this is an adult, but on an infant it would be a fontanelle. And in the back we would have our posterior fontanelle here. Over here on the side in the region of the pterion, we would have our sphenoidal fontanelle. I would like to mention the pterion. The pterion is a region where four bones are going to connect. We have our frontal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, and sphenoid bone. And the reason why this region is important is because the bone is very thin at this point, and then what lies posterior to this is the middle meningeal artery. So a blow to the temple can be very damaging. I'm going to take this for a moment and pull the bones apart so you can see them individually. The easiest one to take off, of course, is the mandible. That's our jawbone. Take that off on the bottom. Then we're going to separate our viscerocranium, which houses the face. We'll look at that in a minute, from our neurocranium, which houses the skull. So here we have our frontal bone. Here's the ethmoid and the vomer. So the vomer and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid are what are going to contribute to our nasal septum. I'm going to take out the single vomer, set that down. Then we have the ethmoid. I'm going to take this one out. We will, again, look at these in greater detail in just a moment. Then we have the sphenoid. Can you see how the sphenoid sits inside the skull here? Okay. I'm going to take this one. Well, let me take the frontal bone off first. Here's the frontal bone. Okay. Then we have the two paired parietal bones. I think I could take the sphenoid off next. Here's the sphenoid. Do you remember I said that looked a little bit like a butterfly or a pterodactyl? We're going to look at this bone in a much greater detail. Let's take my temporal bones off here on the side. Okay. And again, we'll look at these later. Temporal, paired parietal, individually large flat bones, paired occipital bone with the foramen magnum for the transmission of the spinal cord. Let's go back to the viscerocranium, the face here. We have our two little zygomatic bones that make the cheekbone. We'll take a look at those. Right on the bridge of the nose, we have our two nasal bones. Okay, this is actually paired bones. They come apart. Here, you can see these little lacrimal bones. Okay, you see the groove in here. That's what helps make that tear duct. In the front, we have our maxilla. I'm going to take the two halves apart and show you the inside. So this bone here, the inferior nasal concha, is its own bone. So you're asking yourself right now, you have an inferior nasal concha, what happened to the superior and middle? We're going to see those on the ethmoid bone later. But the inferior nasal concha is its own bone. And this bone in the back here, this L-shaped bone that extends the palate of the mouth, is the palatine bone. And again, this is the maxilla holding the upper teeth. I'd like to take a minute to show you the fetal skull because this shows the fontanelles. So remember, we had our frontal bone here, parietal bones, temporal bone, and occipital bone. Where the bones do not come together before the baby is born, this is our anterior fontanelle, also called the bregma. This is our posterior fontanelle in the back, called the lambdoidal fontanelle. And over here, we have our sphenoidal fontanelle.